Bringing you the very best music for film, TV, and video games, this is the Cinematic Sound Radio Network.
Welcome to Composer Conversations. I'm your host, David Coscina. In this episode, I talk with Theodore Shapiro, an award-winning film composer whose career spans 3 decades and who has provided exceptional scores to a diverse body of work including The Devil Wears Prada, Marley and Me, Tropic Thunder, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, The Invitation, Captain Underpants' The First Epic Movie, and Trumbo, just to name a few from the more than 80 projects he's worked on. I had the opportunity to discuss Shapiro's most recent work on Bombshell, Spies in Disguise, Trolls World Tour, as well as his approach and methodology to Destroyer, which came out in 2018. Additionally, we talk about music technology, Shapiro's compositional background, and even the impact of working from home during the pandemic. It's good to talk to you since I guess it's been Captain Underpants the last time we talked.
That's right.
So I was having listened to a lot of the stuff you've done since. Destroyer is just amazing.
Oh, thank you.
It's so nuanced and layered. It plays almost like a concert work.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a really exciting experience. And, the way that Karin and I work together involves a lot of pre-record work. And that has sort of proven to be really instrumental to our whole process.
And I was actually going to ask you that because you've worked with her on, was it 4 or 5 different projects, starting with Girl Fight back in '99.
Yeah, I mean, so we've been working together for 20 years now, and she's really one of my closest friends. And her husband, who is the co-writer of Destroyer and The Invitation, is one of my best friends. We went to college together, and so she is family to me. On The Invitation, we started working in this way where the process begins with a exploratory improvisational pre-record session. So she's very involved, and it gives us an opportunity to be in the studio with brilliant players and to let her respond in real time to, what excites her and what attracts her. And then so we have that session. It's the first thing that happens. Although I will often, I'll set up a structure for the session. So I'll come up with melodic, harmonic ideas to build the session around. And then we have this session, and then I just start writing, based on what we've come out of the session with. And, sometimes that can be just sort of literal executions of the things that we've recorded, and sometimes it's taking a snippet of what we've recorded and building out compositionally from the snippet. And it's just proven to be a really good process for us. It's definitely a game-changing process for us, I think. In the case of Destroyer, where I wrote the music prior to production, that music went to the department heads, and it went to Nicole Kidman, who was, gracious enough to say that it helped her sort of understand the character in some way. And it helped Karin, I think, to build certain sequences. She shot certain sequences with the music in mind. And it's just been great for me to have the music be a part of the process in production rather than the normal arrangement where you're responding to what has happened in production.
Yeah, I was going to say it almost, the way you approach it is sort of a composer's dream, because you get to really exist in a different world versus being really tied to tempo and of a scene, the editing, the acting, all that.
Yes.
So you can really explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And with a picture editor who's attuned to music, in many cases, it means they're actually cutting the scene with a piece of music in front of them. And so with a good collaborative process with the picture editor in place, that editor is really making your music look good because they're cutting the picture with it in mind. And that has been an important part of the process too.
I would guess that most music editors probably have a background in music rather than, say, editing, so they are very musically inclined, or if you're lucky, you get someone who has that kind of ability to work with a composer, and then they will employ those types of techniques to really bring out the best in what you were intending too.
Absolutely. I mean, my music editor, my primary music editor with whom I work, Tom Drescher, is a critical member of my team. And I think of him as an editor in the way that an author thinks of their editor. He is more than just somebody who makes spotting notes for me. He's an important sounding board, and in very many cases, he has cut something together with my work that makes me look very good, and it is really the result of his talent and hard work.
And I think that's probably crucial to when people get into any kind of industry, forming those kind of long-standing relationships pay off, because then you can almost operate in sort of a shorthand.
Like in all things, having a team is so important. And you have to have that shorthand, and I feel incredibly lucky that I have such a good team in place, people that I love working with. Tom is one of them, Chris Vogel, my recording engineer, Mark Graham, who always conducts for me and is one of my two principal orchestrators, and John Thomas, who is the other principal orchestrator. All of these people, they're just vital to what I do, and I love working with them. So it's one of the joys of the job to get to collaborate with people that you trust and respect.
And I guess it's great to have that kind of variety where you've got these long-standing collaborators that you go to when they have a new project, but then you're also fostering new relationships with new directors, new filmmakers on other projects. So you have this really great balance of things that you probably could be perhaps even, depending on the director, more experimental, or they'll give you a little bit more rein for creativity because the project warrants that, whereas other ones, that has to conform to a very different probably ideology as far as scoring.
One of the things that I love about my job is that every time out it's a little different. It never feels rote, and every movie is its own puzzle to crack. And I mean that both in terms of the creative aspect of it, finding the sound, reconfiguring your orchestra, or reconfiguring just sort of how you're going to make a new sound that fits this project. And it's also true in the sense of the personal dynamics of the job. Like every movie has its own power structure. In the best ones, the director is empowered to make the movie that they want to make, and you are really engaged creatively just with the director. But there are also certainly projects where you learn that the director's not really in charge, and you have to sort of figure that dynamic out. Maybe it's the studio, maybe it's the producer. And by the way, there are also really happy marriages where the power structure is shared. It really is a combination of the director and a producer, and they get along, and they're in a productive dialogue. Or it's like easy to bash studios, but sometimes they do their job really well, and the relationship between the director and the studio is productive, and again, a productive dialogue. That's certainly not always the case, and you certainly do see processes that go amok. But what's interesting as a composer is that every time out, it is a little different, and you do have to navigate different forces.
There's actually two questions I was going to ask. One of them is, do you find that being restricted actually makes you more creative? That you were mentioning problem solving earlier, and when you have a canvas that's maybe not as expansive in a case like the smaller works, or even something like Bombshell, which could have had a humongous budget, but it's a very specific ensemble and a sound that you went for. And I think it really pays off. It's again, Bombshell is a phenomenal listen on its own. It really has its own narrative that it imparts. I'm just wondering if you like having that challenge of sort of a smaller palette or something, or you get an idea, like a concept.
I think parameters are really important. That was something that when I studied with John Corigliano, he was always a big proponent of parameters for himself. Just because otherwise the possibilities are too limitless. I find them to be very helpful sometimes when you are in a situation where you have a constrained budget. The choices that you're forced to make end up helping you, because they end up making you develop a sound that is just different, and something that maybe you wouldn't have pushed yourself into it if you'd had limitless resources. In the case of Bombshell, I definitely could have. It wasn't a huge budget, but it was okay, and I definitely could have had a larger ensemble. But as I started writing, anytime I used an ensemble string sound, it just felt like too much to me. Like, it just wanted it to have the intimacy of that chamber approach. For whatever reason, the idea of soloists for strings and then a brass complement that felt more like a traditional brass complement, that felt like the sound. And the budget probably was somewhat influencing to me. I had to be smart about how I spent the money. It wasn't just endless. And to some extent, that might have shaped my perceptions. But I also just remember at times when I was working on the material, anytime that I did experiment with putting more, strings on a part, I just felt like I was in the wrong landscape.
It's a great score, and the intimacy because of that sort of chamber ensemble and it's very eclectic. So I think there's taiko in there, and there's harp.
Yeah.
I think there's a trap kit, upright bass.
Yep.
Really cool stuff. And then of course that main figure. I love that kind of descending. It almost has, it's not fair to always, every time you put a seventh chord, it's like, hey, that sounds like Bernard Herrmann, but I guess because he did it a lot, and he had a lot of descending kind of things like that. But it's really cool. It's a really neat quality.
There was an idea that we wanted to capture about Fox News and these women in that very toxic landscape of, using voices to express both an idea about self-presentation, that could be somewhere on the borderline between robotic and expressive, and those seventh chords to me feel, I don't know, like it sits in that sort of point of tension where it's really pretty, but almost fake pretty with all those major sevenths. And there's a point at which I have to stop talking about it because music is abstract, and I and part of it is guided by intuition and musical logic. But that was the guiding force of how I got there.
That's actually a really good point. Maybe it's difficult for people who are interviewing composers to ask questions or convey ideas. So sometimes that will go to almost a presumption of what the composer intended. And you even see academics doing this with long deceased composers like Bartok. Some orchestrator
Sure.
saying, oh yeah, in the second movement of the Concerto for Orchestra, he was figuring the overtone series and sat the bassoon in there. And another historian I know says, yeah, no, he was just looking at angels in the closet. I don't think Bartok was actually thinking of that. So it's kind of one of those things,
Yeah, exactly. And look, I mean, I've written those papers too, when I was in college, and it's super fun to take apart music like that. And sometimes you do have an idea that's driven by something really academic and conceptual, but sometimes you're just guided by your intuition about where the notes want to go.
When you were going to university, did you always want to be a film composer, or you just wanted to be a composer and then you discovered sort of film? Because I know at that era was very academic, and God help you if you wanted to write tonal music.
Well, it's funny. I actually had the opposite trajectory of what you just described, which feels like the more stereotypical movement. You start out wanting to be a composer and you get lured to Hollywood. Mm-hmm. I actually started out when I was an undergrad, I really wanted to be a film composer, but I also knew that I went to a liberal arts school, and I got a great education, particularly in the areas of theory and musicology, but a little bit less so in actual practical composition. So I knew that I wanted to go to a conservatory for grad school and have that kind of really practical experience. So when I was in grad school for a master's, at that point I got a little bit more interested in concert music. So that when I graduated, in the years after I graduated from grad school, I was really had a foot in both worlds. I was writing some commissions, and I was also doing some TV and film work. And it was, at a certain point, I had to make a choice about sort of which fork I was going to follow. Going back to your question about the atmosphere at grad school, I feel like I was at Juilliard at a pretty interesting time, because it was starting to shift at the time when I was there. You had Milton Babbitt there and David Diamond, whom I studied with, but then you also had John Corigliano, you had Robert Beezer, who isn't that well known, but he's a really fine composer who had been Thomas Newman's contemporary at Yale. So just in terms of his age, I'm trying to think, and David Del Tredici. So you definitely had a bunch of tonal composers there, in addition to some people who were a little bit more severe in their musical outlook. And it was just starting to shift, and the idea of the disdain for writing music that communicated with an audience, that was shifting too. I still think that there was a premium placed on writing complex music. When I look at what's happening more currently in concert music, I see a lot more music being written that's even more directly communicative with an audience. I think it's a great time for concert music right now. I think there's some fantastic music being written, and so I think that it's continuing to move in a positive direction. When I was there, it was still in a transitional moment.
Probably because of how many composers now in the concert world are 40s, 30s, 20s, and they're informed or been influenced by film music. And then there's also more film music being presented in, like, played with picture. That's a big thing now where you get to see.
Yeah.
And that's really great because it again brings maybe general concert goers or general public into the eyesight or understanding of how disciplined the art of film music is.
I think so too. You know, I'll point out a couple of anecdotes. My very favorite writer about music is Alex Ross, who writes in The New Yorker. And the way that he has written specifically about John Williams and specifically has been really smart about pointing out just the complexity of the work. You know, there is a tendency to, among some film critics, to write pretty facilely about Williams' work. It all sounds the same. It's some bombastic. You know, even just within the last year in the New York Times, a critic wrote that his work for Star Wars was emotionally battering. And which I was tempted to write a letter about, but didn't. But Alex Ross wrote about, just as an example, the opening theme in Star Wars and just the little chromatic complexities that are embedded in it. You know, the way that he writes to give the music harmonic interest is just so great and so evident of incredible craft. And I think that there is just an increasing understanding that many film composers have tremendous craft, whether they fit into this sort of weird teleological narrative of compositional progress, which I think has sort of happily died. You know, that's being thrown to the wayside now. And I think that what people are starting to look at more is like, is it good music?
Great points. And I know Pauline Kael was never a fan of Williams, although I think she wrote something favorable towards his score to The Fury.
Can we talk about Pauline Kael for a little bit? So everybody should try to read her review of Raiders of the Lost Ark. So she starts out the review of the movie, which, by the way, is one of my very favorite movies. She talks about marketing teams taking over Hollywood, and it's incredibly prescient. It's so smart, and it so accurately predicts the path that the industry went down. And then she gets into the review of Raiders, which is pretty much a pan of the movie, and it includes a total dismissal of Williams' score, which I think that we all know is a masterpiece of the craft. And so it's just this fascinating thing where somebody who, you know, obviously regarded as one of the most important American film critics ever, in the course of one review, writes something that's so smart and so prescient about where the industry is going, and at the same time reveals a complete ignorance about what the craft of film composition is. You know, even if you don't like it, fine. Obviously, everybody's entitled to their opinion. But to dismiss the work without acknowledging the total mastery of the craft means that you don't understand the craft. So that, I think, is fascinating.
And someone in that kind of position, I'm sure it's frustrating for film composers. And it makes me wonder whether there was, I guess, at point, there was a divergence in film where it went from big studio systems, which existed for 30 or 40 years. And then I guess in the 60s or 70s, you started getting into this auteur, this kind of cinematic rebel where they were kind of breaking from the big studio systems, doing whatever they wanted, or at least that was the romanticized idea that they were doing that. Some of them actually did. Lucas, I think, with Star Wars and Coppola. But I think that's still was this, that kind of break is still pervasive. It's sort of like, you know, it's all about product nowadays. But if you think about it, it's really, it's always been about mass entertainment. And yes, I'm sure there's areas of filmmaking where that don't have to be about that, but it's a business like anything else. And you can't really crucify the people that are working within those conditions and doing a very good job of it too.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, look, the point that I sometimes try to remind my frustrated filmmaker friends, when they're directing a movie and are frustrated with the studio system, is that you're taking their money, having had a little bit of experience with the world of concert music. So there's a situation where like you're given a commission and you can do whatever you want, but there are strings attached to that, which are, in the case of concert music, like a much more limited audience and much less money. And when the studio writes a multi-million-dollar check to make a movie, to some extent, I think you're signing up for the constraints that comes with, as frustrating as it might be. So, the business is there to make money. And as frustrating as it is with the kind of, people often bemoan the product that Hollywood makes, but Hollywood corporations are not iconoclastic. They are going to make the movies that people vote for with their feet by showing up for them. So that's how we are where we are, is that people show up for superhero movies and they show up for very particular franchises. And so ultimately we gotten to the place where those are the movies that Hollywood studios are making. But at the same time, there's a lot of great work that's being done. So much great work. A lot of it's going to appear on your television screen and not in a movie theater. But there's certainly there's no lack of good work being done. So that's inspiring.
And I think the other part of this, the Pauline Kael thing, is also film score soundtrack fans, I think, have this, again, romanticized and misguided idea of what it actually takes to produce a film score. And it always requires a team. This idea, this romanticized ideal, there's this brilliant composer in a dark room with bread and water, and he's coming up with just pure gems of notes. That's not accurate. Never was.
No, it's really not. And first of all, it's a collaboration. As a film composer, you're part of a team. You are, by definition, you are helping the filmmakers execute their vision of what the film is. So doing good work is dependent on a positive collaboration with your collaborators. Sometimes you get into a groove where you're writing music that's really exciting to you, and it's also exciting to the filmmaker, and all of those good things converge into one project. But sometimes you're working on a movie that is flawed. So the purity of your compositional process is waylaid to some degree by the fact that that by nobody's fault even necessarily. Just the ideas aren't harmoniously flowing together to make one whole. And so that can be because the vision that you have is different from the director's vision. It can be because you and the director are on the same page, but the studio intervenes. But it also can be things like, here's a good example. In the process of finding what the movie wants to be, you have to chip away music that shouldn't be there. And ultimately, there aren't enough spots in the movie to establish the musical ideas that would really make it a fully satisfying musical experience. And sometimes that's just a sacrifice that you have to make as a film composer to make the best movie. Sometimes the thing that would make the most satisfying, robust score is not the same thing that will make the most satisfying film. And so, I think being a good film composer requires that you check your ego enough to understand that the necessities of the film come before the necessities of the score.
And of course, it is always a bonus if you can still are able to produce something that is able to transcend the film. Oh, that's not a prerequisite, though. I think that, again, that's more marketing.
Right.
That's kind of came in when soundtracks became a really big business, because even back when we're talking about the 80s or the 70s, there's so many scores never came out. They were written for the film.
Right.
And then, those of us who loved the music when it was on TV would, to put a tape recorder up to the speaker and record the opening and end credits. And that's all you got usually, unless you wanted to record the whole movie.
Yeah.
And it's become a big business. And then because of that, there's this rabid fandom that is now, or not now, but has been existing for the last 30, 40 years. Let's say 30. Again, there's this presumption of sort of thought about what something should be. And it's all about expectations. And I guess based on, especially with a composer as an established body of work, people who follow that composer look forward to it. Think, I'm going to expect. I see this movie. I see what it's going to be, and there's probably a little bit of expectation. And then, if for some reason the movie, like you said, has some issues through not necessarily anybody's fault, but then it just kind of deviates from there, then that's what creates sort of that response, which I'm sure is frustrating too for composers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't read reviews. I don't read reviews of my movies, and I certainly don't read reviews of my soundtracks unless my wife sends me something. It's like, oh, you should read this. It's
cool.
So great. But if I ever, or put it this way, one of the reasons that I don't is that, there's no way for anybody to really understand the process that you went through. So a composer, let's say a composer was forced to write a score with mind-numbing, repetitive ostinati, and they themselves might feel embarrassed about it and feel like it wasn't as musically satisfying as what they would have really liked to have written. And in fact, it was nowhere near as musically satisfying as version 1.0 that they submitted to the direct. There's no way for that information to be disseminated. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I can understand why, if you are a fan of soundtracks and you're really excited to hear a score and then it ends up being less than what you were hoping, why it would feel really disappointing. But there's just a lot of things that go into the process that you just can't know unless you were part of it.
I don't know if you've been following the whole Spitfire Westworld thing that happened. The Spitfire Audio had a competition where they were going to, so that blew up completely, unfortunately for them.
What do you mean?
Good intentions. Well, it blew up from the standpoint that the person they awarded, it created a lot of controversy because it seemed like he wasn't following the rules really strictly. He actually is a sound editor, and had worked on some Abrams movies, but he never met him. Anyhow, he came up with a very, very original, very unique cue. And I think they had like 11,000 submissions. Yeah. So, and this kind of also gets to the point where technology, while it's helped a lot of people realize the things that they hear in their heads, it's also maybe it's democratized the craft maybe a little too much, and people have false expectations or ideas of what they really are capable of. And that was a rude awakening. It's like, they started saying, Spitfire didn't listen to all the examples. It's not possible. These are all these. And then a few seasoned professionals came in and said, listen, if you keep posting like this, no one's going to ever hire you. Ever.
Right.
Because you're not behaving well.
Yeah. Oh boy. I mean, the internet is really, that's a whole topic. The way that people behave on social media and in forums and etc. is really it just produces some really short-sighted behavior. The stuff that you post online is there forever. Whenever if ever I'm interviewing people to be an assistant, I can run a search. I can look for people, I can check people's Facebook pages and see what they've written on a forum or whatever. And that, that's meaningful. So anyway, if you're listening to this, and this is what I would say, in the event that some of your listeners are aspiring film composers, I'll say this. When I was just starting out, when I was very far from the industry, I felt emboldened to say things. I mean, at that time there wasn't an internet, thank God, to post them on, but like to say things about how so-and-so was a hack and blah, blah, blah. And then, the closer that I got to the industry and the more I realized just how hard it is to make a movie and all of the things that go into it, the more I understood that you just have to ratchet up the empathy and understand how difficult filmmaking is and the film compositional process and that the people, the composers who find themselves in these great productive relationships like Williams and Spielberg or you name it, they're really lucky. They're really, really lucky. And my advice and plea to young composers is if you're going to post something on the internet, do it with empathy.
Getting back to technology just for a moment, since you've actually worked since the 90s, so I mean the industry's changed quite a bit since then. I'm just wondering, how are you finding the tools of the trade? Are they informing how music is written, or do you think not? It would have gone this way as a natural progression.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think that the tools are pretty incredible. In general, like I find that I'm just off the top of my head, just a couple of things that I'm grateful for. I use Cubase. I think it's a great program. I was on Digital Performer for many years, which I also really liked, but I'm really loving Cubase. And I use Ableton Live, which I think is awesome. And just going back to how we started this conversation about Destroyer, the discovery of Ableton Live and the way that it manipulates audio is really the thing that enabled me to start doing these experimentations with audio, where I could do a recording session and not feel like that constrained me. I still felt like I'd have the flexibility to do with the audio what I wanted. That's a big deal. So I'm very grateful for that. Just the proliferation of libraries is so amazing. When some of the stuff that I think that Spitfire Audio has done, particularly in terms of like the Evo grids and sounds that evolve and ways in which you can make these evolving sounds that aren't necessarily going to be the exact same evolving sound that somebody else is using on another project. That's a huge deal, and it's a great compositional tool. And even if so maybe arguably that opens the door for somebody who doesn't know the craft as well to do something that sounds like you do know the craft really well. I'm just grateful to have that tool at my disposal, and I think it's a good thing that those sounds are available to composers, because here's the deal, like in the world in which we live, you have to be able to demonstrate your ideas to the filmmakers, and so if you can't mock it up, then it becomes a lot harder to integrate those sounds as part of your score. It doesn't really work to show the filmmakers an outline of like, oh, this is what it's gonna sound like, and then have it be different when they get to the scoring stage. Filmmakers pretty much want to know what it's going to sound like, and then they get used to that thing. So I think that the more tools that are available that enable you to demonstrate complicated ideas, it's just a benefit.
I interviewed Christopher Willis, and he actually said something that I think was almost a revelation as far as demystifying or maybe explaining why there was this period of time where everything was very ostinato, short strings, staccato based, and he was saying that undoubtedly various film composers did, like you were saying, the version 1.1 was maybe a very florid, very fluid, lyrical, soaring thing, and then the samples were they weren't up to the same standards. So the filmmaker goes, yuck, I don't like that. And then, so we had this era then of, short articulations, because just by their very nature, they don't ring out. So they sound closer to
you got what.
So yeah. And that was like a big pail of cold water, like, holy smokes. He just basically said, he said, this is the reason why there was that kind of style. It was out of necessity, just so the film composer could obviously produce the work that the filmmaker liked.
Yeah.
And now it seems like because the level of samples is much improved, and the expression, and also we're seeing more hybrid scores too.
Yeah.
And something like Destroyer was just, it's this beautiful symphony of colliding sounds, textures, musical motives. It's like any great electroacoustic concert work for me. At least that's how I mean, it's just, that's going to be, just, it will continue to play for me because it's so fascinating. I'm just wondering what plugins you use in it, because it looked like you were using a lot of DSP or like a lot of effects processors too, manipulating, or was that all Ableton with the acoustic instruments?
I mean, first of all, let me say as a side note, like, that's a score that I couldn't have written if I'd started with MIDI. It's so much about the performers in the room, and you can't get the samples to do that stuff, and so, or at least not yet. Maybe at some point soon. So that's just another plug for that pre-record process. It's so helpful. But as far as plugins go, definitely some of it was in Ableton. One of my favorite pieces of gear is my Model D, my Moog Model D. It just is awesome. As far as I am aware, there is no emulation of it that comes close to capturing what it does as hardware. And it's just an awesome instrument. And that was definitely a big part of the sound in Destroyer. It's just so huge. It stands up to a full orchestra, and it's weird because you can play something with it, and it's not even like the waveform looks that big. Like, the waveform looks small, but yet somehow it's just taking up so much space. So anyway, it's a miraculous piece of gear. So that, I also have a hardware reverb unit, the Strymon Big Sky, that is really a beautiful sounding reverb. So that was another thing. And I have a Prophet 6, which I know that I used with some importance in that score. So in addition to the virtual tools, there was some hardware involved.
Uhi, Zebra, and things like that, or Repro, or
definitely
Omnisphere.
Zebra. Yeah, definitely Zebra. Probably Omnisphere. I mean the big ones for me are Zebra and Omnisphere, and the Arturia stuff I think is excellent. I don't know that I used it on Destroyer specifically, but I think that they do great work.
Did you have a fairly formidable brass section for that? There seems to be, because it sounded like it. You can tell the difference. It just had that kind of weight and portent to it. And it's like, ooh, this is tasty.
Yeah. No, the brass complement was there were no trumpets, but 4 horns, 3 trombones, and a tuba. Yeah.
Sounded great.
Oh,
it
cool.
Sounded great.
Thanks.
I do want to talk just a little bit about Spies in Disguise and Trolls.
Oh, cool.
World Tour, because I think they're fun. They're fun scores. They're smart. I would say that's probably the adjective or the 2 descriptors that I would say to any of your scores, which is smart and fun. Although I guess Destroyer's not fun, but it's smart and engaging and captivating. So for something like Spies in Disguise, where you're dealing with a genre where there's so many musical sort of tropes, as it were, how do you kind of approach that and say, okay, I know I have to fulfill the job, which is provide the underscore, but what can I do to inject that satisfies you as a film composer, that gets you up in the morning and says, hey, I've got to work on Spies in Disguise?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, that score is, the movie's a 2-hander. And so, meaning it's really just about these 2 characters fundamentally. And I felt like there was a lot of juice to be squeezed from the contrast between this very chromatic idea for the Lance character played by Will Smith, the sort of cool spy, and then a very more open, sweet idea for the Walter character. What ended up happening in the process of making that movie is, first of all, as many of you know, or maybe you don't, like an animated film is a long process. And so, you might work on that for years. When I got involved with that film, the Will Smith character was really the hero of the movie. It really was focused on him. And by the end, it was clear that the hero of the movie is actually the Tom Holland character, Walter. And that was just the evolution of the script. And interestingly, I think that Will Smith himself was instrumental in pushing it in that direction. He sort of understood that even though that he was the star and sort of the first actor attached to the film, I think he very adroitly saw that the heart of the movie was the Tom Holland character. Anyway, when you get involved with a spy movie, it is tricky because the Bond scores are so iconic and you feel like on the one hand that language is embedded in what the idea is of being a spy, and on the other hand you don't want it to sound like a Bond ripoff. I don't know. I came up with this 4-note chromatic descending thing that felt like it was, on the one hand, engaged in that language and in a way that was helpful for describing who the character was, without it just sounding like a repurposing of the Bond motif. So that was how I approached it, and it was also a little bit of a challenge to see, like, what can you do with just 4 notes descending chromatically in order. And because it was tricky in a way. It did not lend itself easily to writing melodies on top of that harmonic sequence. It was tricky to do. And so at first I was like, oh man, I'm bummed that the directors liked this because it's really hard. And and then it became a fun challenge to see, what can I do on top of that?
Well, luckily, film can, of course, entertain various approaches. Could be a chordal type of theme rather than more of a melodic one, or it can be even a texture or even a specific, like a genre. Like I noticed, like in the Trolls World Tour, there was these repeating, hard rock almost like alternative rock from the 90s type of things. And clearly, I haven't seen the movie, but again, it still tells its own story by having these pivotal sort of identifiers that then are recapitulated, or they're varied in some way. But it's like, oh, okay, I've heard this before, and now it's being developed, or it's something. So it has its own inner logic.
Yeah, well, in the case of Trolls, the whole movie is about genre. It's about these troll tribes that are defined by their musical genre, and so a lot of the storytelling in the film is really about genre signifiers. And telling the story by moving, through one genre to another, or superimposing two genres on top of each other. And that's a different kind of compositional experience than, writing the Force theme for Star Wars. But it is what was required for that movie. And it was a lot of fun to do. It was its own satisfying puzzle to solve.
Yeah, I like the smooth jazz chaz, the 80s soft jazz style. Oh, that just took me back. There's a real talent and a real technique that's required to be able to draw from these different genres over these different eras and still dress them up in the same clothes as the material for the film, so it doesn't sound like a complete pastiche or it distracts. It's still within the setting of the film, but it has those nods.
Well, I'm glad it feels that way. That is for sure. That's the challenge of a movie like that, and because the comedic style of the movie is so frenetic, and the movie takes you to so many places so quickly, and it's so bonkers in certain respects. The score really felt like it had to keep the movie's narrative logic on track and just keep everything running down the tracks smoothly, and provide some sort of a blanket for the whole movie so that it felt like it all fit into one frame. And that was what I was hoping to pull off, and hopefully I did.
Absolutely did. As with all of your work, again, intelligent, fun, emotive. What's on the future? Speaking of those things,
let's see. So many things. I mean, I'm currently finishing up a movie called The Good House with Sigourney Weaver and Kevin Kline reunited, which is really a fun movie with two directors that I love working with, named Maya Forbes and Wally Wolodarski. And then I'm also doing this movie with Jessica Chastain and Andrew Garfield called The Eyes of Tammy Faye. About Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. Their performances are really superb. The director is an old friend of mine, and collaborator, but we met in college, named Michael Showalter, who made the excellent movie The Big Sick. So that's been really fun to work with Michael. We've known each other a long time, but it's been a long time since we've worked together, and so that's been a great experience. And then a ton of things that are gonna happen once people start going back into production, and so I'm trying to take this opportunity during the pandemic to start writing on things that have not started shooting yet. So again, the directors can have something in their hands when they do get back into production.
What's your process been like being at home now rather than sort of having that defined space that you go to during the day, sort of separating church and state? Now you're working from home. So how does that work for you?
It mostly works fine. I mean, so my wife has graciously given me her office at home. So I have a little studio, and I have my Model D. So that's good. What I don't have is a large screen to look at. That is an impediment. So that I miss about the studio is like I don't have a huge image to look at, and I think that on some psychological level, it helps. It just helps to be looking at a huge image. It makes it feel more like a movie. So I miss that. And I miss my speakers. I've got to be working on headphones, and that's because for a while it was because my kids were in school down the hall, and so I didn't want to disrupt them, but also because, with speakers, I mean, this room is not even close to being acoustically correct. At least with headphones, I know that I'm listening to a correct sonic image, and so it's just the way that I have to work. So I will be very, very happy when I get to go back to the studio, but it's there's just too much happening here at the house, and I need to be a contributing member of this household. So gotta be here and be a good family member.
I think that's actually something that is interesting. The balance of personal lives, family, with this kind of vocation, which can be very all-consuming.
Yeah.
I don't know, when you're on a project, if there gets to be, I don't know if this is with all composers, sort of an obsessive quality of sort of working things out in your head, even when you're immersed in a keyboard, you're hearing these ideas in your head sort of circulating. And is it hard to be sort of in the moment when you're on a project because that's sort of omnipresent?
Yes. I mean, I do find that, so I do find that, when I'm in the middle of my compositional process, that's where my head is a lot, and I am not, and I do struggle being present. But I also, from a schedule perspective, I come home in normal times. I would come home every day at around 5:30. I mean, maybe if I'm in the thick of a crazy project, I'd come home at 6:30 or 7:30 is just, things are nuts. But I really believe in getting home and spending time with my kids and my wife, and so that's just how I do it. I also think that time away from the studio is helpful just creatively. Like it is important. I've been struck by how many times, like, if I'm struggling with something, I figure, okay, I got to just get out of here, and then on the drive home is when I figure it out. Just because, like, you need to get away from Cubase or whatever your DAW is. And sometimes just the tyranny of that click coming at you is limiting your ability to just think outside of the grid, and
that sometimes does prescribe certain things that you might not want necessarily.
Absolutely.
And then you have to kind of fight against that to get to that other point. But
absolutely, yeah. The click is so, it just leads you in a certain direction, and it's really, really important when you can, whether it is by working on paper or or something like staff pad, or by turning off the click and conceiving of time without it. It's just really helpful for writing interesting music. I mean, it's the way music has been made for a long, long, long time, and it's good to push against its tyranny.
Actually, I find retrospective record to be brilliant on Cubase.
Yeah.
If I am, because you don't have that little fascist beep, beep, beep there, you can just write, and for some amazing way, it transcribes it really intelligently and frames it in that so it's not a lot of difficulty to sort through it, because it does it really, really well. So at least that's one thing. One last question. What kind of music are you influenced by these days, or that really kind of inspires you?
Okay, let's see. I mean, I've got a list of things that I've been listening to lately, but I don't know that I don't know if there's any sort of umbrella concept. I mean, I've been listening to this album by a fantastic chamber group called Why Music. The name of the album is Ecstatic Science. It has two pieces by a fantastic young composer named Gabriella Smith, and an excellent piece by Caroline Shaw, who's a wonderful composer and singer who actually sang a lot of the vocal parts in Bombshell, and she's amazing both as a composer and a performer. So I've been listening to that. I really love it. Another album that's really had great staying power for me is Michael Kiwanuka's last album, which is just called Kiwanuka. That is really a superb, beautifully produced record, and I've really loved it. The new Fiona Apple record is great and just totally unique and weird and fantastic. I don't know. I think that is. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I've been listening to. No, I mean those are the big ones as of late.
Well, Teddy, thank you very much for your time. As always, it's just a pure treat to talk to you about everything musical, and wish you the best on your upcoming projects, and hopefully we'll get past the pandemic sooner than later, and then things can get back to normal.
Yeah, I hope so too. And thank you so much for having me on this. This was really fun. Just a pleasure to talk to you, and we'll do it again.
Thank you for tuning in to the Cinematic Sound Radio Network. I want to thank Tim Burton for providing his voice for all the bumpers and stingers you hear throughout the program, and David Coscina for providing Cinematic Sound Radio's theme music. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email us at cinematicsound@yahoo.com. You can find us on social media at CinSound Radio on Twitter and Cinematic Sound on Facebook. And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, please take a moment right now to rate the show and write a brief review. Reviews help introduce potential listeners to the show. And while you're at it, head over to TeePublic to get a Cinematic Sound Radio t-shirt. And don't forget to check out Cinematic Sound Radio at cinematicsound.net.